I thought my life was safe until one confession broke my heart. My best friend looked into my eyes and admitted she loved my boyfriend. I never knew my own cousin had helped them betray me. I'm Kaliska Ravenwing. I work as a wildlife photographer in Oregon. I trusted my family more than anyone, and that trust became my greatest mistake. The afternoon light filtered through the cafe window, casting long, golden shadows across the table. I had been excited for this, eager to tell Sarah about the new trail I'd scouted in the Cascades. We had been inseparable since grade school, our bond forged in the quiet understanding of shared history. When she arrived, she didn't smile. She sat down, her hands trembling as she smoothed her napkin, and the air between us suddenly grew heavy with a weight I couldn't yet define. The confession came not as a shout, but as a hollow whisper that seemed to drain the color from the room. She loved him. She was in love with Mark. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird, while my mind scrambled to find a logical explanation for her words. But as she spoke, the details began to blur with a terrifying familiarity. She knew about the surprise dinner I had planned, the specific dates Mark and I had argued, even the small, private jokes I thought were ours alone. It was impossible for her to know these things unless someone was feeding her the script. My throat tightened. As I sat there, stunned and silent, a cold realization dawned on me. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She had an accomplice. My cousin, Elena, who had always been so supportive of my relationship, had been the conduit for every private detail Sarah now wielded against me. I walked out of that cafe into the gray Oregon drizzle, the world I had built crumbling into dust. In the weeks that followed, the memory of Elena's laughter echoing at family dinners took on a sinister resonance. I started to map out the timelines in my head, cross-referencing moments where I had felt a strange, lingering gaze from Elena. She had been the one to suggest double dates, the one who constantly pushed me toward work assignments that kept me away from home. Every time I had been vulnerable, Elena had been nearby, watching, noting, and reporting. It wasn't just coincidence, it was a systematic dismantling of my domestic security. I felt like a stranger in my own life, tracing the edges of a reality that was being manipulated by the person I thought was my closest kin. I retreated into a shell of forced normalcy, my camera becoming my only solace. The lens provided a barrier between me and the suffocating tension of my interactions with Elena. I began to look at the photos on my hard drive with a different eye. I noticed Elena in the background of images from Mark's birthday, her expression not one of celebration, but of calculated patience. She had been weaving a net, and I had walked right into it, blinded by the assumption that family, that blood, carried inherent loyalty. The betrayal wasn't just from a partner, it was a multi-layered deception that had been festering in the shadows of my own home. One evening, I returned early from a shoot, the silence of the house pressing against my eardrums. I heard hushed voices coming from the kitchen, Sarah and Elena. They were speaking about money, about legal documents, and about a secret bank account tied to my own identity. My breath hitched. It was a chaotic symphony of malice. They were not just stealing my life, they were erasing it. Every word they uttered was a shard of glass, cutting away the remains of my trust. I stood in the hallway, frozen, as the realization of their long-term scheme hit me with the force of a tidal wave. They had been laughing at my expense, mocking my dedication to Mark, and actively working to replace me in every sphere of existence. The anger was a cold, white-hot fire, but I forced it down. I knew that reacting in the moment would only alert them to my discovery. I sat in the darkness of my studio, the hum of the forest outside the only constant. I began to understand the depth of Elena's jealousy. She had always resented my independence, my career, the way I carved out my own path while she felt trapped in the expectations of our family. She didn't want to just be me, she wanted to destroy the version of me that existed. She had manipulated Sarah's insecurities and Mark's weaknesses, orchestrating a tragedy where she played the director, hidden safely behind the curtain. I moved through the days like a ghost, maintaining the facade of the naive cousin and the unsuspecting girlfriend. It was a grueling performance. I watched them interact, noticed the nervous glances between Elena and Mark, the way Sarah would quickly look away when I mentioned the future. I catalogued their mistakes, the inconsistencies in their stories, the hidden messages on their devices, the quiet moments of triumph they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. I was collecting ammunition, piece by piece, while my heart withered into something hard and resilient. The pain was still there, a constant ache, but it was being tempered by the cold, clear logic of survival. My father was the only person who had ever truly seen the world as I did. He was a man of few words, but his integrity was the bedrock of my upbringing. When I finally brought him into the study, the weight of the evidence laid out before him, his face remained impassive, though his knuckles turned white against the mahogany desk. I showed him the printouts of the encrypted messages I had intercepted and the bank records I had painstakingly tracked. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me it would be okay. Instead, he looked at me with a profound, aching sadness that confirmed everything I had feared. We were in this together, and for the first time since the coffee shop, the crushing weight of the secret lifted. We became a unit, calculating and deliberate. My father spent hours with me, organizing the evidence into a dossier that would be impossible to dismiss. We verified the metadata on the messages and cross-referenced the financial transactions. It wasn't just about catching them in a lie, it was about ensuring that the truth would have a consequence. The planning felt like a military operation, stripping away the emotional residue and focusing on the facts. I felt a surge of strength, not the kind that comes from rage, but the kind that comes from finally knowing exactly where the enemy stood. I was no longer the victim of their games, I was the architect of their downfall. The final confrontation happened at our family's annual summer gathering. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the artificial cheer of the occasion. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood up, the dossier held firmly in my hands. The room fell silent as I spoke, not with shouting, but with the measured, terrifying clarity of a woman who has nothing left to lose. I laid out the messages, the dates, the financial records, and the lies that had been spun to tear my life apart. I watched as their faces shifted from confusion to arrogance, and finally, to the gray pallor of absolute, unmitigated panic. Sarah began to cry, Elena tried to speak, but the truth, once spoken, was an unstoppable force. The aftermath was swift and devastating. Elena's life, built on the shifting sands of her deception, collapsed within weeks. The financial records I had produced were turned over to the authorities, and she faced severe legal consequences for identity fraud and embezzlement. More importantly, she lost the one thing she craved most, the respect and inclusion of our family. My father stood before the entire extended family and dismantled her reputation, not with malice, but with a firm, final refusal to ever acknowledge her again. She was cast out, left with nothing but the debris of her own ambition. The house was finally quiet, the shadows of betrayal wiped away by the cold, harsh light of reality. I stood on the porch of the mountain cabin I had rented to find my own center. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and coming snow. I watched the golden eagles circling the crags, their flight path precise and purposeful. I was alone, but for the first time in my life, I felt entirely complete. The path back to myself hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. I had let go of the need for their approval and the ghost of the life I thought I wanted. I looked down at my hands, steady and strong, ready to capture a world that was vast and wild and, most importantly, mine. The cycle of noise was broken, replaced by the symphony of the wind in the trees and the quiet promise of tomorrow. I walked to the edge of the clearing, the camera strap heavy and reassuring against my neck. There was no looking back at the wreckage. It had been swept away by the mountain winds. I adjusted the focus, the landscape sharpening into a brilliant, crystalline clarity that made my heart swell with a renewed sense of wonder. The past was a closed book, its pages heavy with lessons I would never need to repeat. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs and purging the last remnants of the doubt that had once defined me. I wasn't waiting for a new beginning anymore. I was already living in it, one frame at a time, finding beauty in the truth I had finally earned for myself. They stole my trust, but they never stole my future.